Hi everyone that's coming in. We'll just leave it a few minutes for everyone to filter through. In the meantime, thank you for joining us today, taking time out of your busy morning. Do feel free to interact with us if you want to introduce yourself in the chat, tell us who you are, where you're coming from, maybe what the weather's like with you, and we'll kick off in a minute or so once we've seen those participant numbers creep up. But for everybody joining, good morning. I'm just seeing the numbers keep going up there. So we'll be kicking off in a few minutes once we've seen everyone come through. If you do want to explore the options to interact with us today, we do have the chat available. So do say hello and introduce yourself. We'd love to get a bit of conversation going. And equally, if you want to ask questions, please do use the Q&A function too, because we love hearing your questions and interacting at the end of the session. Okay, I think we'll kick off. I can see the numbers leveled out. So again, good morning. Very exciting to be talking to you today about diversity in apprenticeships. I'm Beth Sampson, I'm the People Lead at Investors in People, and I'm joined by an exceptional panel today. We've got Paul Devoy, who's the CEO of Investors in People. Hi, Paul. We've got Jane, who is the CEO of Creative and Cultural Skills. And we also have our non-executive director, Jo, joining us today. So I think if we kick off, I'll just ask you each to introduce yourselves and why you're interested in this topic. I'll go to you first, Jane.
Thanks, Beth. Hello, everybody. Great to be here with you. My name is Jane Ide. As Beth said, I'm Chief Exec of an organisation called Creative and Cultural Skills. Some of you may know us. We are the UK-wide agency that works to create and support opportunities to develop into careers in the creative and cultural industries, as you'd expect. We have a very particular interest in supporting young people, particularly those from disadvantaged backgrounds, those who are furthest from the jobs market, into meaningful careers. And very much part of that is our passionate belief in the role of apprenticeships as an inclusive and a fair way into those careers that might otherwise not be quite so accessible. And I'm delighted to be here today.
Thanks, Jane. We're super delighted to have you. And I'll go to you next, Jo.
Thank you, Beth, and thanks for having me this morning. Welcome, everyone. Nice to have you join us. I was going to say nice to see you all, but of course we can't. So nice to have you join us. So I run Blue Moon, which is a diversity, equity and inclusion consultancy practice and executive search business. We've been going under the name of Blue Moon for 3 years, but all in all, the organisation's been going for about 14 years. I'm also a very proud non-exec director for Investors in People. And of course, the work that we do both within Investors in People, but also within my own organisation is to make work better. So apprenticeships is certainly a way that I think we can do that for people of all ages. And so I'm really excited about discussing how we get real benefits out of the apprenticeships.
Thanks, Joan. Thanks for joining us this morning. So I'll go to you, Paul.
Beth, yeah, I'm delighted to be here as well. Apprenticeships is something I'm really passionate about. I came from a council estate. Nobody that I grew up with went to university, but you know, vocational education was a route for lots of us to get to learn and earn. And I think apprenticeships are a great way of getting people into work and on in work and significantly improve their life chances. So the more that we invested people can do to help apprenticeships become much more open to all communities, to people from all backgrounds, then I think the better impact that that'll have on society overall.
Thanks, Paul. And I know all of you joining us today are probably equally as passionate and interested in this topic. So I hope you enjoy the next sort of 35, 40 minutes. As I say, we'll be keeping it sort of fairly informal. We've got a couple of questions that we'll be discussing as a group, as a panel, but we do want to hear from you. So please submit your questions through the Q&A and we'll be tackling those towards the end of the session. Equally, introduce yourselves in the chat. If you want to comment on things, please do. It's nice to see you because, as Jo said, we can't see your faces. So it's nice to see that interaction coming through. So without further ado, I'll kick off with our first question, and this one's around attraction. So panel, I'll ask you, what must an organisation have in place to increase the chances of success for the organisation and the apprentice? And do you have any examples or experiences of when it's gone wrong or maybe right? Shall I go to first? Jane?
Shall I kick off? I think it's really interesting, Beth, actually, because I was just thinking, listening to my colleagues introducing themselves and what I said. The place I'd like to start is that we absolutely believe in apprenticeships as a fantastic way of creating a more inclusive workforce, of giving people opportunity that might not otherwise be the case. But the thing that we see that doesn't work, if I start at that end, is when an organisation thinks that they want to create an apprenticeship as part of their social responsibility. You know, this is something we're going to do. It's a good thing for us to do. We're going to help some young person who wouldn't otherwise have an opportunity to come into the world of work. And the reason that doesn't work is that the thing that we would say for any employer thinking about an apprenticeship is this is a proper job. This is a job with training, and therefore it has to start on the basis that you have a role that you need filling, that an apprenticeship might be the most effective way of achieving. And I think if you start in that place, that's where we see the success happening. So starting from that point of view of what is the role, what is the work we want somebody to do? How are we going to support them to learn? Because by definition, an apprentice won't know how to do that job. But putting into place all the things that you would put in as any responsible employer about any role that you might want to recruit for, to make it a success, and treating it in that way rather than as something that's other or different. And for me, I think that's, or for us at CC Skills, that's the absolute fundamental place that we want people to start from. It then becomes something that you can use in a way that attracts different talent, gives you an opportunity to bring in different voices, different experiences, different perspectives. But it's always got to start from that point of view that it is a proper job that you need doing and that you're prepared to pay for.
Absolutely, thanks, Jane. I think that's something we've talked about internally, isn't it, Paul? It really needs to fit in with the strategy of the business when you create an apprenticeship position.
Yeah, absolutely. So when a couple of years ago, the Department for Education commissioned us to develop a standard about what a good apprenticeship looked like, and we conducted a huge amount of research and a large consultation exercise to identify what were the key ingredients of an excellent apprenticeship scheme. And one of the things that comes out right at the top of our framework is having a business case for your apprenticeship programme. And the best apprenticeships that I've seen are ones where the organisation uses apprenticeships as a key plank in their people development strategy, and it's linked to their overall organisational strategy, and it's a key way of developing the right skills and talent for the organisation to fulfil its mission and purpose. And when that's there, that means that apprenticeships are not on the side, they're in the core of what the organisation seeks to achieve. And therefore, when you do that, it attracts the right type of resource, it attracts the right type of management attention, and therefore has a greater chance of succeeding. So making sure that an apprenticeship is a core part of your people development strategy and making sure you've got the right skills for your workforce is key. What I would say though is the other part of the research that we found is that a good apprenticeship scheme will seek to recruit people from as diverse a range of sources as possible. Quite often with SMEs, you find that they tend to recruit within quite a narrow network. So one of the things that we want to encourage is that organisations of all sizes look beyond their existing networks in the way that they recruit, and they recruit from as wide a range of networks as possible and broaden their horizons on that, so that the apprenticeship recruitment process is as inclusive as it can be. Because when it is, all the research shows as well that the organisation succeeds as well as creating the social good of having a more diverse intake.
Thanks, Paul. So definitely moving away from the kind of word of mouth type recruitment, maybe.
Yeah, and I think that it's understandable in a lot of SMEs. It's somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody. Oh, I've got a vacancy, or I know somebody that would, but and they don't necessarily have apprenticeships as part of their overall strategy for how they develop the workforce, and they don't necessarily recruit from as wide a pool as possible. And that's, I'm not singling out SMEs particularly here. It's just they don't generally have the capacity to have a sophisticated approach. But certainly organisations of all sizes have been guilty of that in the past, and they're missing a real opportunity, I think.
Absolutely. So obviously that's your area of expertise as well, Jo.
Yes, I would echo a lot of what both Paul and Jane have said there. What I would add though is there's another element to this, which is I think the attitude and the culture within the organisation about apprenticeship. So typically in my experience, and of course now we focus on executive search, but for over a decade we focused on entry level to early careers, and also those that are slightly more experienced. And now with the experience of looking at more senior people that have joined an organisation, it's not seeing I think it's really important that organisations don't see apprenticeships as a kind of a favour being done to people that are underrepresented or marginalised. That it's absolutely just another method of recruitment, which is a useful method of recruitment. So to Paul's point, it's really important that you go out to a really diverse range of sources and backgrounds in which you can engage with a really broad range of talent, but you're not lessening that talent just because they're coming through an apprenticeship route. And sometimes organisations from a leadership level may totally understand the benefits of an apprenticeship and understand it legally and understand it commercially, and also understand it from a talent and people perspective. But sometimes that's not been articulated or communicated clearly enough, or the position that you hold and the values that you hold around apprenticeships haven't been communicated clearly enough. So an apprentice comes into an organisation, whether that's a 77-year-old apprentice, a 50-year-old apprentice, or an 18-year-old apprentice, comes into an organisation and they're expected to bend and curve and sing and dance to the tune of the current existing culture. And they're also seen as kind of as in the same way that diversity hire, when you have a diversity scheme or an internship program that's focused on a particular demographic, you are sometimes seen as a scheme. They've been given some upper hand in some ways, or they've been given this advantage that those from other backgrounds haven't, all of which are really ironic and laughable in reality, but those assumptions. But the point is that there is this attitude sometimes that once somebody comes in, they've been done this huge favour, and actually no. Remember, as an organisation, you're only as good as your people, which is why it's so important to make work better for them, because the better it is, the more you get from really talented groups of people. So I think that's a big thing that needs to change. The organisation needs to see it as just another method of recruitment, and give those individuals their equity, that they are just as valuable as anyone that comes in through any recruitment process into their organisation. I also think that when we talk, and I'm speaking now about those from underrepresented backgrounds who maybe earlier on in their career who've used apprenticeships as a route in, there is I think a sometimes missed opportunity by organisations to prepare for that talent. So those, organisations perhaps like the Cultural Skills Council and others prepare young people. They invest in them, they spend time with them, they understand their needs, and they make sure that they're ready to go into the world of work, right, through various tools and resources and support. And there's a lot of heart behind many of those organisations. So the young person comes in very prepared, even to the point where if they're from a low socioeconomic background, there's organisations that will provide them with clothes, with their first day's bus fare money, or train, their first packed lunch, for example, so they can go in with some, some pride and dignity. And then when you get to the organisation, they've done nothing to make sure that individual goes right in and hits the ground running. Instead, there's been no rhetoric around, not seeing this as underprivileged person coming in as a disadvantaged, therefore less talented, or that we're doing this as a real favour. They should be really grateful that they've been able to get onto this apprenticeship scheme. They haven't done the preparation actually to say, we're welcoming a really talented individual for example, so let's say they have autism. What do we know about autism? What does the team know about autism? How can we make sure that that person comes into that team, hits the ground running, feels as valuable as everybody else, and feels that sense of belonging? And I think when I talk about attitude, that's what I'm talking about. You have to prepare for your talent in the same way that you're expecting them to prepare so much for interview in that process. You have to change your attitude and articulate really clearly that apprenticeships are incredibly invaluable people, also apprentices, sorry, and be aware of the privilege that sometimes comes with not having to consider some of the things that those coming through an apprenticeship may have to consider. So in the instance of what Paul said, you know, first person, he, you know, people in his family or in his local community maybe weren't seeing university as a route in. So there's people that did go to university that will have, there's some privileges that come with that. So just be aware of those things. It doesn't make you better or more valuable than the apprentice, but be aware that you have a privilege that they perhaps haven't had experience of just yet. Thanks,
Jo. Fantastic points there. And I suppose, you know, maybe there's something around the line manager and how they're prepared for that apprentice coming through too. I know that's an area that you're interested in, Paul.
Yeah, but again, going back to the lots of research that's out there, and I quote this, I unashamedly quote this in virtually every webinar that I'm on, but we've got 2 million accidental managers in the UK. And that's someone who has been promoted into a management position, but without giving them the training to do it. So we would never let someone be a nurse or an engineer or a lorry driver or whatever occupation you would like to think about without training them properly. But we seem to think that anybody can just, management's just something that you pick up. And I think an apprentice's experience of work will be heavily influenced by the effectiveness of their immediate line manager. And we need to put more emphasis on supporting managers to actually look after the apprentice properly. And it's not fair to put someone in a management position without supporting them to do it. Managers are people too, and they have their own pressures. And I think during the pandemic, being a manager of a team has been one of the most challenging jobs, because you're trying to look after their welfare. You're probably going through a pretty tough time yourself. So we need to invest more in helping people in management positions to succeed, because only by helping them succeed will they be able to be in a position to help their team succeed. And somebody said to me the other week there, it's a bit like if you're on an airplane and they always tell you to put the oxygen mask on yourself first because you can't look after your family. You can't. So it's a kind of similar sort of thing. We don't look after our managers, they're not going to be in a position to look after the people in their care. And I think that's really an important point with apprentices. We need to really make sure that the line management that they're going to work with is well prepared to look after them and nurture them and develop them in the right way. And I think that's got a lot to do with the kind of dropout rates that you get in apprenticeships, that hasn't been properly considered.
Thanks, Paul. And completely unprompted, you've given me a perfect segue into the next question, which is about retention. So often success with apprenticeship schemes is measured by things like completion rates. Do you think there's an opportunity here to look at other success metrics? And what might those be?
Beth, could I just come in on this one? Is that all right?
Absolutely.
It was just to add on also to what Paul said around managers. I think he's absolutely spot on with that, and obviously the evidence says that, so there's no wonder. But in regards to a kind of an additional thing is also inclusive leadership and inclusive management. So there's management training, which is absolutely crucial, and I'm not surprised by that number at all. Based on the work that I do, I can see that there's lots of work that needs to be done. But what I would say is that lots of work that needs to be done in terms of upskilling managers, absolutely. But there's another piece in there as well about understanding how to manage different individuals as a manager. So, you know, what I may require as a Muslim woman, for example, might be completely different to what somebody needs as a working class white male, for example, and so that's just some of the things that they're going to need within culturally lived experiences, you know, key moments in a year that are really important to them and will impact on productivity. Perhaps some of these are just two examples of kind of other elements of identity that can be really quite challenging, and we can't expect managers to know all the differences of individuals or all their intersections but it's important that we train them in inclusive leadership so that actually they know how to be open to some of those conversations, to start them using, you know, the right open language and education in the first instance. But also that there's just different management styles. There's some people that like to be micromanaged and others that like a little bit more, or, you know, autonomy. So that inclusive leadership, not just around identities, really, really important as well, I think. And in answer to the actual question, which is around retention, I think that when what people miss the opportunity to do is to hold sort of listening groups once they have apprentices into an organisation, and have those listening groups at various stages of their journey within the organisation, so you can actually start to pick up what does it really feel like for them working here on this apprenticeship scheme, so that when your next cohort of apprentices come in, you're really aware of some of the things that didn't quite go so well. I think there's also a good opportunity in listening groups to understand how you keep talent through an apprenticeship, and I think it's actually some of the most successful things I've seen when I've gone along to client presentations on their apprenticeships has been actually we took an apprenticeship route with some of these individuals, but we've kept them. They're now in employment. So we have actually seen it as a permanent recruitment tool and not a contract recruitment tool. So I think when you want to measure that, it's who wants to stay at the end of their apprenticeship and how have you prepared for roles, and that left some open. So actually there are opportunities to do that, because otherwise you can be using an apprenticeship scheme for your commercial and legal reasons, and not actually as a people tool, as a way of getting the best people into your organisation, and then keeping them on.
I completely agree, Joan. And one of the things that I've heard working in an organisation with a very successful apprenticeship scheme is they actually look to hire members of the cohorts into their kind of apprenticeship support team, so that you've always got that kind of constant feedback loop of people that have actually lived the experience of going through that are then working on making the scheme better. Paul or Jane, do you want to jump in on this question?
Well, I was going to say, for me, all of these points kind of all interlink really, because and Joe's absolutely right. This isn't just about how you treat your apprentices. It's about how you invest in your staff. It's about how you support your managers to look after your staff. And I was just thinking as Paul was talking, we do a lot of work at CC Skills to support managers. We run workshops, we provide guidance, we have all sorts of good practice guides and so on and so forth. And some of that is about the practical stuff, you know, how do you set this up properly? How do you think about the role that you're actually asking somebody? How do you choose what apprenticeship you're actually, you know, applying for the role that you want to do, and so on and so forth. But actually underpinning all of that is that point about culture and inclusivity. And for me, the fundamental is that you are investing in talent for your business. And I was thinking back, you know, one of the things we talk a lot about at CC Skills internally is that, you know, apprenticeships actually started centuries ago in the craft industry. And it was the way you would invest in the skills of somebody coming up behind you who would be the master craftsman of the future. And I find it quite painful to think of any organisation that doesn't recognise and see that by investing in skills and talent at entry level, you're actually building that skill and talent either for your own organisation or for your sector, because the truth is, of course, not every apprentice will stay forever with the organisation they're trained with. But I do absolutely as well, I think, to pick up on that point of Joe's at the end there, you know, there are too many organisations who perhaps think of an apprenticeship as a fixed term, short term thing. We're going to have this apprentice in, they're going to be there for 2 years. When they finish their apprentice, they're going to go off and do something else. And I think that partly relates to my original point about those who perhaps are doing it as part of a social responsibility action rather than a workforce development role. Having said all of that, I think that within the creative and cultural industries particularly, there are some very real challenges in that a lot of the things we're talking about here are the sorts of things the big organisations should be able to do. They have a team, and we work with some big organisations in the sector, some of the big theatre companies and creative businesses who do have an apprenticeships manager who runs the programme. Who, one of them, I was talking to one not that long ago, and she said, you know, she said, I'm like the mother hen, you know, I look after our cohort of apprentices, but, you know, we have a dozen a year, and I make sure they get all the support that they need and they can then go on and thrive. And they have those structures in place. But actually, the vast majority of our sector is much smaller organisations. There might be 3 or 4 people, there might be 1 person, and how they can actually think about doing this work effectively in order to really have the opportunity to build those skills for somebody in the support for their organisation, but in a way that works for that individual as well, is different. And I think one of the things we're very strong on at CC Skills is the need to be able to literally flex apprenticeships in a way that will work in practice rather than look good on paper. And there's some really exciting moves coming forward about flexi-job apprenticeship schemes, which I'm delighted to see the funding's the funding's been announced this morning around that, which I think will be quite transformative for our sector, because it will enable organisations that don't necessarily feel able to commit to that long-term support of an apprentice because of the way their industry works, but can really make a meaningful contribution to that individual's journey through skills development that they need in order to have a thriving career. So it's quite a complex picture. It very much depends on the context that you're working in, but it absolutely fundamentally comes down to, are you an organisation, whether you're big or small, that wants to invest in your people? Sorry, had to give you a plug there, didn't I? That wants to invest in your people and sees that as the way your business will thrive in the future? Or are you coming at it of, well, here's a bit of cheap labour that we can make use of for a couple of years, or something that we'll do because it gives us a tick box that we've done something meaningful, but actually we're treating it as something separate and other to our main purpose of workforce development. And I think if you get it right, it's fantastic. And if you get it wrong, you're just damaging people. And I can't quite see what the value is of that for anybody, to be honest.
No, absolutely. Thanks, Jane. And I think, you know, metrics are very important, but if you're only looking at something like completion rates, that just doesn't tell the whole story, does it? Engagement's important, and investment's important. How those people are thriving and developing and progressing, that's important too. Paul, I'll invite you in.
Yeah, no, I worked in skills policy and government for a number of years, and you know, I was party to some of the conversations that they had around about how you try and put the right incentives and levers in place, and I think that one of the issues with completion rates is it's one of the main levers that they pull, because they attach money to etc. to try and as always when you do things like that and you try to engineer a system, it has unintended consequences attached to it, and this is a classic example of that, and because there's targets around completion rates, that's what drives people's behaviour. And therefore they don't necessarily look at the apprenticeship and around. And we know it's just a fact of life. Because of the levy, there will be employers who will be taking on apprentices because they're seeing it as a way of clawing their tax back, or what they perceive as a tax back, and that will be driving their behaviour as well. So for me, it kind of circles back round to what we said right at the outset of this conversation: is why are you having an apprenticeship scheme, and is your apprenticeship scheme an authentic exercise and actually looking to develop your workforce? And that's a fundamental question that you need to ask yourself, and then everything you do flows back from that. And the completion rate is very important, but it will be a measure, not the measure. And I think that would be a more positive approach if we can get more organisations seeing it as a measure, an important one, but not the measure, and not the thing that drives all the behaviours. And I have quite a lot of sympathy for training providers, because their funding is heavily predicated on completion rates and the rate from Ofsted and all of this kind of stuff. So they work really hard to keep people on their courses, and sometimes they don't necessarily get the support from the employer that they need. And I hear quite often frustrations from training providers about that. And again, that circles back to that's because the employer's motivation for doing it in the first place wasn't properly thought through. So in our framework, we very much advocate that, about having the business case and then thinking about your apprenticeship programme from that point onwards, and how you make sure that you have the right management support, the right career progression, etc. All of those things will add value if you do that. But in the absence of it, it can be a bit transactional. And therefore, I think inevitably in those situations, you don't get the same outcomes.
I think if I can jump in on that one, because many years ago I used to work in the NHS, and the mantra there was what gets measured gets done. And I think Paul's absolutely right. I can absolutely understand why completion rates, it's an easy metric. You can tick a box. Has this person completed? Have they not? Yes or no? It's easy to measure, but it does really drive that sort of sausage machine mentality where the overall measure of success is, have you got these kids, because they do tend to be obviously younger people, they're not always exclusively, have you got them through this process from A to B? Right, good, we've done our job. I would love to see it kind of flipped on its head, because I think failure to complete is an important metric. Understanding why somebody may not have made it through to the end and what needs to be changed in order to change that outcome for them as an individual is important. But I think, for me, the ultimate measures of success have got to be, there's got to be a twin assessment of it, hasn't there? This is not about something being done to a person who's gone onto the apprenticeship either. This is not just about a success measure for the employer or for the training provider. It's also got to be a success measure for that individual, probably above all else, because it is their life, it is their pathway that's at stake here. And so there has to be more creative understanding of, has this been a success? Has it worked well? Has everybody in that relationship got something meaningful out of it? Would that apprentice choose to carry on working in this industry, in that career, in that employer, if the opportunity is there for them? That's the big success from that point of view. And would the employer feel that they've got value from having delivered that apprenticeship? And would they actually like that apprentice to carry on working for them if they have the capacity to offer them a role? Those are the successes. Those are the sorts of things that any employer, and I'm thinking of this myself as an employer now, more than a UK-wide agency. I want to know whether somebody I've recruited has been able to do a great job, has brought value to the organisation, is somebody I'd like to keep if I possibly can, but I recognise that sometimes circumstances might mean I can't. That's the success for me. And for myself as an employee, my success is, have I felt able to do a great job, and do I feel able to move on from there? It shouldn't really be more complicated than that. And those are the things that get lost, I think, in the sort of data-driven metrics that are inevitable when you're looking at huge numbers. But ultimately, for an employer, that's the responsibility, I think, is to do everything you can to make it that very successful process for everybody concerned.
Thanks, Jane. I think that's so true. Rather than getting lost in the sort of analysis, just stripping it right back to that human level of what does success mean for those human beings, that are in your business, is spot on. And I'm aware we're sort of halfway. We're at 11:30 now, so I just wanted to nudge everybody attending. If you do want to engage, ask some questions, we very much want to make sure you get as much out of this as possible. So moving on to progression, I'm just interested to open the floor to you on this topic, actually. To what degree do we understand that career progression and succession plans for apprentices should be aligned to those for graduates, for example? What are your thoughts on that?
I can't see why they wouldn't be, to be quite honest, if I'm really blunt. I mean, again, coming back to the recurring theme, if you're thinking of your apprentices as something other, perhaps slightly lesser, as Joe was saying, sort of somebody that you've given a special privilege to, then, you're completely barking up the wrong tree, and you're missing a really important trick as an employer. For me, I think if you see apprenticeships as part of your workforce development, then it is a route in. It is a route that is perhaps more accessible for a lot of people, particularly those who have economic disadvantages, because it's more affordable. The blunt truth is it's a more affordable way of learning how to do a job than it is to perhaps go and do a degree or whatever else. And in our experience, in our sector, it's actually a more effective route in many ways, because it really does focus on the skills that are needed to do that particular job. But if you see it as part of that, then once somebody has completed their apprenticeship, then absolutely, why would they not have exactly the same opportunities to progress as anybody else, and if not better, because they may well be better skilled than somebody who's coming from a different route. Our concern, and I think this is an area where, if I'm blunt, I think there needs to be more work done, we need more evidence gathering, is whether or not the barriers, and I think this is something I'll throw over to Jo, because this is very much her specialist subject. But if as I said, one of the reasons we focus very much on apprenticeships is because it does give that fairer access to opportunities. But there's no getting away from the fact that, by the same token, people taking that route may well have a number of what would be considered disadvantages, shouldn't be, but are disadvantages in the workforce, in the workspace now. And my worry is that we are still in a place where we introduce young people, particularly, into these routes. We open the door, we say, in you go, here's a great apprenticeship opportunity, fantastic. We shut the door behind them, and then they fall off the cliff the other side of it. Because when they come out at the end of that process, they still have the same barriers of being female, or of a different ethnicity, or disability, or socioeconomic background, or all the things that are not privileged in our world. And that's the thing that frustrates me, but that's not so much to do with apprenticeships per se. That is to do with the world of work and our society and the world we're in, and how we need to dismantle those barriers in order to give everybody that fair and equal access to opportunity. But I'm going to chuck that one at Jo and see if she agrees with me.
Absolutely agree with you. And one of the points I made at the top of the when I introduced myself at the top of the webinar was around the fact that apprenticeships can be for everybody. So as I've mentioned in previous conversations ahead of this, there's organisations, especially retail organisations, that some of their eldest apprentices are 77. These are individuals who may have been working in one sector for a really long time, have kind of been encouraged to move on in a way by employers, but still feel really, able and excited about working. And so they go into different sectors, and apprenticeships have been a really good way of progressing individuals and giving them a new set of skills, and as a tool to move from one industry to another, where you've got transferable skills, but maybe you need to upskill and expand your capabilities. And maybe that's a good way of doing that. But you can absolutely use apprenticeships to progress talent. And as I say, that's why those listening groups are so important, because they'll tell you what's missing in those processes. And if you go back to the point that Jane's making, that if we treat apprenticeships in the same way as we treat any other recruitment process, well, you would do the same in any, if you're reviewing your people, you would review what our recruitment policies and processes are like, how successful they've been at bringing in a broad range, how well we've done at keeping that talent. So that is in the same way, and how have we progressed that talent is exactly the same approach that should be taken really when we're thinking about apprenticeships. Yes, we've attracted a diverse group of people into our organisation. Excellent, great. How have we nurtured, built, and created a sense of belonging for them and developed them? Some of the points that Paul was talking about. And then, okay, they've stayed with us. Even better, one of our measures is we've been able to retain, right? Then how do we progress? I used to hear a lot more often, and I don't hear it as much now, but individuals say, I was an apprentice when I started in the organisation, and now I'm like one of the MDs. I've heard that story. I just don't hear it enough, right? So it's all about your attitude, the behaviours, the processes, and absolutely not seeing it as a contract piece that we've touched on before. And actually, this is just a route in. Now they're in. What do we do to keep them and build them and progress them? I think there's also some missed opportunities in that organisations could do, which is to share a little more about what's working, what's been effective in their organisations. And if you're in a particular sector, I've always felt there was a missed opportunity to actually share effective practice, not best practice. We use that term a lot, best practice. Just because something's best practice doesn't mean it's been effective at all in achieving anything. It may just be the way we've always done it. So actually what's been effective, and if you can go to some of your peers, competitors, and see what's worked in terms of ensuring that apprenticeships are seen as a valuable and equal way as any other recruitment process of coming in, which actually just provides a bit more equity to those underrepresented groups, then I think you're actually onto something. So there is a lot you can do by sharing, by listening, and also by understanding that apprenticeships are not what they used to be, where the rhetoric was around, we touched on craft, but it was also sort of engineering and sort of trade roles that people were kind of sent. It was the perception was that you did that if you weren't academic, or if you did that if you weren't able to go on to university. We're not in that space anymore. You could be highly academic or not. You could be, you could be incredibly ambitious. All of the things that apprenticeships historically were not aligned with, those kinds of terms: aspirational, inspiring, motivated. They're kind of seen as, and certainly even the way it was sold to me when I was at school was if I remember thinking about an apprenticeship and someone saying, no, you're far too academic to do an apprenticeship. So even the language use around that is the kind of legacy that I think we're trying to change at the moment. And you can absolutely use it as a tool for progression if we think about them as an alternative route for people who are already experienced and for those that are wanting to join the workforce.
I'd like to see a world where apprenticeships become I'm looking at this from the point of view as a parent of two young men, one of whom did an apprenticeship and then went on to university afterwards. The other one didn't, and I really wish he had. And I would love to see apprenticeships as being as aspirational for parents and for teachers and for careers advisors as the university route is. And you're so right, Jo. The language that's used, somebody was commenting, I think it was actually, we did a podcast a few weeks ago around apprenticeships, and one of the panelists on that was saying even the fact that we have to talk about degree level apprenticeships still implies that's actually the goal, is to really be at university level. Yeah. Whereas actually a really well-trained, skilled apprentice who knows how to do the job that you need them to do is like gold dust. What employer wouldn't want that in their business? And that's not to denigrate degree. I think degrees are fantastic for the right roles and for the right people, but it's not the be all and end all to go to university and get those letters after your name. And I would just love to see us, again, one of the things we're passionate about is having that commitment to vocational training, to vocational education, to learning skills, to putting those skills into practice, to being able to develop and think about how you bring out new skills and how you add more creativity to the work you're doing. That for us is so important, and to have that given the same standing in the world as the more traditional academic routes is what we're really aspiring to, I think, at CC Skills. And why wouldn't we? Why would that never be the case? It's crazy. It's probably something rooted very deeply in the great British class history, but I think it's just something we have to change. The world is different now, and it needs to have so much more opportunity for people.
I think it is changing. And I'm anecdotally, I've got a 16-year-old and a 13-year-old, and I hear parents talking much more now about apprenticeships as being a route, more so than certainly you would have heard in the past. And I think it's because of the whole issue around about debt, and I think people are becoming aware of we're investors in people, but when your child is coming out of the education system, what investment of their time and future debt they're going to make, and what's the economic return. And for a lot of degrees now, and I make myself quite unpopular with some people in HE when I say this, but a lot of degrees now have very little in the way of what they call wage gain, what your earning potential will be over your lifetime compared to not having gone to university to complete that degree. A lot of them don't have a lot of them don't heighten your earning potential at all, whereas an apprenticeship in most cases does. So that economic argument is becoming stronger and stronger. I think it is starting to percolate through parents. I'll be honest and say, in my experience of having conversations with my son's teachers, they've generally 99% of them have gone to school, university, back to school. And they don't have that perception. They still perceive the vocational route as where non-academic people go, and academic people go to the to university, and that paradigm still persists from my experience. And I'm only a sample of one, but from my experience, that paradigm still exists, and the issue is, I still think that the career advice that children are provided in school is not as good as it should be. I see often something that I call a poverty of ambition, and a lack of expectations about what you should be able to expect. And people think, well, I've come from a certain background, I'm not worthy of anything above that this is where my level. And that was the way I was brought up. And one of the things that I've drilled into my sons is you should not have a poverty expectation. You should aim to go as high as you can. The only limiting factor is how much effort you're prepared to put in to get there. That's the only limiting factor, and you control that. But if you're prepared to put the effort in, you may not achieve your ultimate goal, but you'll achieve more than you thought you could have if you have that higher expectation to start with. And then returning to the point about progression in work, with some roles, there does seem to be a bit of a glass ceiling about how people perceive what the progression could be if it's like a level 2 apprenticeship. But I think in all organisations now, and we've been doing work at Investors and People with the In-Work Progression Commission that's been led by Baroness McGregor Smith, and the report was published back in July. And what they found is that, organisations will become more productive the more they look at how they can promote in-work progression at all levels, about how people get on in work. And again, what we want to do at Invest People is to support organisations to really think hard about in-work progression for all levels. The government's particularly interested in it because their tax credits bill is increasing every year. And they're looking to try and say, well, how do we get people get on and create higher value, get on into higher value jobs. But what I know from the work that I did in government is that organisations don't think enough about creating enough high value, high quality jobs. And there's a demand issue. So if we can work with employers to create a strategy that's more around creating a high performance workplace that creates good jobs, then that creates that room, that headroom for progression for people to move up and into. So I think as an economy, we've got a demand side problem, is that we don't create enough good jobs. We have a big long tail of low skill work, and we have a small pyramid at the top of people who are highly skilled, there is a shortage of, but we've had a hollowing out in the middle of the kind of technical middle level jobs, and technology and all the range of other things have had an impact on that. We need to kind of move the pyramid up so that we have more lines of progression from low skill work up into intermediate and higher skill. But that requires organisations to think differently about their workforce development strategy and their overall business strategy to make that a possibility.
Absolutely, Paul. And one of the phrases that I'm loving at the moment is moving away from that career ladder to more of a career climbing frame, moving across, moving up, changing. I think we're working for a long portion of our lives now, so it's about breadth of skill as well as sort of promotion and progression I think you're absolutely right, Beth, and we're certainly seeing some really interesting stuff happening with younger people who've come into the industry and who are carving their own paths and who are creating their own professions almost. But I think, to pick up Paul's earlier point about careers advisors and teachers, that is an area there needs to be we do a lot of work, but there is so much more that needs to be done there, because I would agree absolutely with your summary of it, Paul. As a parent of a son with severe dyslexia, I've always felt school is designed by people who like school and who get on well at school, and education and academic routes are designed by those who think that's the best way to go. And
we have a bit of a triple whammy in our work. So we have the challenge of those teachers and careers advisors and parents, it has to be said, who think the only route is the academic one. Actually, vocational could be really helpful. We have very much, and we hear a lot, particularly from apprentices that we've worked with in the past, about that poverty of ambition point, where if you're in the wrong place, one of our podcast guests recently put it beautifully out, and she's an amazing young woman who's worked with us on one of our quite in-depth programs. But she was saying when she was at school, all her careers advisors wanted her to do was go and work in the local supermarket. That was where she saw herself go. You know, they saw her going, and she had to convince them that she was capable of something much more ambitious than that. And then we get the triple hit, of course, that coming into the creative industries is not seen as a viable career route. You know, I was having a really interesting conversation with somebody the other day who does very parallel work to us, but does it around STEM careers. And we were talking about the fact that, you know, they have the advantage that any parent would be delighted to have their child go and be a scientist or a nuclear physicist or a doctor or whatever it might be. But actually their kids don't get excited about the idea of working in engineering. Whereas we have an industry that is very attractive and very exciting to a lot of young people, quite rightly so. But they have that battle then with their parents, particularly if they've got challenges around economic background and so on, to say, actually, Mum, this is viable. You know, I can make a career in working backstage in theatre or working in a museum or working in an art gallery or whatever it is. And we have all of these challenges to overcome, but there is so much work to be done with the influencers because they are so influential. When you're 16, you're 14, 15, 16, and you're trying to make choices, you might not want to look as though you're listening to what your mum says or your teacher says, but you're hearing it. And they need, you know, those people, I know they do understand they have young people's futures in their hands, but they need to be able to broaden their perspective and not see that something that is very different to their own experience is necessarily a bad thing. So there's some real challenges around that, I think.
Absolutely, thanks, Jane. And we're rapidly approaching the end of the session, but I've seen a question pop through on the chat, which I just thought I'd share with you to explore. And it's around the opportunity for organisations to attract mature apprentices. What are you seeing working in that space?
I was just going to say that I think it's a really good question. Thank you. And I think when we say, you know, are organisations making the most of this? I don't think they are. I don't think they are just yet. I don't think they've realised how, you know, even when they're thinking about apprenticeships, we've now got degree apprenticeships, so we've needed to say degree. So we're already at that point, right, where we've come this far, and now when we talk about apprenticeships in any other form, we've got to make sure that we're clear. Now, I didn't just do an apprentice, I did a degree apprenticeship, because that's clearly, you know, there's some rhetoric around that that's important we state that, right? But so I also think that the organisations are not thinking that there are 40, 50, 60, 70-year-old individuals who want to continue working, who are talented, skilled individuals who want to continue working. And you've got to remember that when we're thinking about groups of individuals who are typically marginalised and therefore need to be protected by the Equalities Act, age is in there. And that is because, you know, anecdotally, my mum is 66 now, but she went for a job 3 years ago. And she called me afterwards and said that she was told that the manager had said to her, I've been told not to hire people at your age because you're not, you're going to retire soon and you won't want to continue working. And the lady who said it to her didn't even realise that was the wrong thing to have said. So maybe if it had been said to her, I don't think it was meant to be relayed to the candidate. But actually, so we've actually got organised, and that is anecdotally, so I'm not suggesting there's hundreds of organisations that are doing that, but that's certainly one where their thinking has been so biased around that they're they're sending managers into these interviews with that bias already in their mind, if they hadn't had it already, just to make sure we wouldn't want someone of that age. And that's entirely incorrect and unethical, and lots of things, to be honest. But I don't think they are using the opportunity to do that. I think that an apprenticeship should be seen as a route in for all ages, as I said at the start, of all backgrounds that want to come into an organisation. Here are the different routes that you can apply for us, through this route, through that route, or through this route, and one of those being apprenticeships, for example. But there's no hierarchy on those. They're just different routes that may be more attractive to you, to make sure that we get a diverse workforce. As I say, the gentleman who's at one of the retail groups, he was on a after we did some work with him, I spoke with him. He was over the moon. He absolutely loved his job. He was very happy. He had great quality of life, and felt a real sense of belonging. And lots of retailers who have taken this on, so the likes of, you know, the Co-op and Timpsons and things like that, and organisations like that, they've been talking about it. They've been making it really vocal. Greggs are another one that really push for this, but we're not seeing it discussed enough. And so I even think for mature talent at home, they're not realising that that's a process also that they can look at and go for, because as I say, the narrative around apprenticeships hasn't been accurate. So I don't think we are taking advantage of it, and there is a huge amount of opportunities that we could do. So using your social media to share that. I mean, I've had people get in touch with me who are looking, who know I do exec search, and saying, you know, do you know any people hiring, because my dad's been made redundant but he's not ready to finish working, and so they're thinking about coming to search firms. I think they also need to be just made aware that there's organisations that you can go directly to who have other routes in as well.
I think it's really interesting, because I'm just thinking it must be 15 years or more since B&Q got some really good PR and some really good headlines about we're recruiting older apprentices, you know, people coming in at retirement age. I'm really curious as to know why it's become something that retail has done but other sectors haven't. And I'm thinking about this in the context of our sector and creative and cultural industries. And I mean, there are some roles in our industry. You know, one of the things I've been hearing people talking about recently is there comes a point when actually the physicality of the role, especially if you have come in at a young age, you know, there's a lot of traveling, there's a lot of heavy lifting in genuine terms and so on. It may not be something that's so attractive to an older person, but that's one small subsector of the work that gets done in our sector. One of the things that people don't realise is that you can have a fantastic career in the creative industries as an HR manager, or there is an absolute desperate need for finance managers in the film industry right now. They cannot get enough. And you know, if somebody's in their later years, later part of their career, and they've got those skills or that passion or that desire, why not go to, I mean this not flippantly, I am quite genuinely thinking that when I reach the point where I don't want to go on doing the sort of work I do at the sort of pace I do it, I'd seriously think about doing an apprenticeship in the sort of role that I would have loved to have done when I was 16 or 17, but none of my teachers and none of my careers advisors thought it was or even knew there was an option to do it. Because I think that, again, the world has changed, and that point you made, Beth, about a career, what do you call it, a climbing frame. I think that, I mean, there's a whole conversation there about how many women have tended to do portfolio careers anyway because they've had to make other choices along the way, and there's a whole gender thing there. But I think more men are becoming more aware of that possibility as well now. And you know, if you want to work, if you've got the ability to do it, if you've got the capacity to do it, and there's a passion or a desire or an interest even to do something, then an apprenticeship can be a fantastic way of doing it. But we still have to do, as Jo says, we have to do a lot more talking about this, because I suspect most employers would look rather surprised if somebody, you know, in their later years approached them and said, can I come and be an apprentice set designer, or can I be an apprentice HR manager, or whatever it is that you want to pursue, because it's just not the norm. And those norms have got to shift, you know, and again, the world is shifting around us, and younger people are shifting that world, and those of us who are a bit further down the line, unless we want to, you know, you're a long time dead, as my mother used to say. So, you know, let's make the most of the opportunity to do things while we can. You know, it's yeah, the world is your oyster.
Absolutely. What a great point to end on as we close up the session. Thank you so much to my lovely panel. Fantastic conversation. I've taken a huge amount away from it, and I'm sure everyone listening has. Thank you to everyone that listened to us this morning as well, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day.